There was a moment during a Gaither vocal band performance when David Phelps set his microphone down, turned away from the audience, and walked off the stage. And the people in that room watched him go, and he didn't come back. Not that night. What followed in the weeks and months after that night, what David's wife Shay eventually confirmed, and what David himself finally put into words after staying quiet far longer than anyone expected, revealed something about the real cost of a calling that the gospel community has never fully heard told this plainly. Stay with us, because what gets said at the 10-minute mark of this story is the part nobody in Christian music has been willing to say out loud until now. And if you've followed David Phelps since the early homecoming days, this is the version of his story you've been waiting for. By most accounts of the people who have actually shared a stage with him, David Phelps is the most technically gifted tenor that gospel music has produced in the last 30 years. That's not fan enthusiasm or channel hyperbole. It's the considered judgment of vocal coaches, fellow musicians, and the millions of believers who have watched his homecoming performances with something that goes well past admiration and into something closer to reverence. Growing up in Texas and training at Baylor University before joining the Gaither vocal band in 1997, David brought something to that lineup that shifted the entire sound of the group the moment he stepped in. Most tenors spend their careers reaching for the upper register and falling just short. David lived up there, and he made it sound natural, which is probably the most impressive thing any voice can do, because nothing about singing at that level is natural at all. The performance that cemented his place in gospel music history wasn't a recording date or a television special. It was a live rendition of Jerusalem at a Gaither homecoming event that fans have shared, re-watched, and handed down to younger family members for decades. A performance where his voice climbed into a register that simply doesn't seem accessible to human anatomy, and then held there. People who were in that room described the reaction not as applause, but as something closer to a collective exhale. Fans who watched it later on video have written, in actual handwritten letters, that something shifted in them when they heard it, that it touched a place in their faith that words alone hadn't been able to reach. For the millions of people who grew up with the Gaither homecoming videos playing in their living rooms, on long family car rides, and in hospital rooms during the harder stretches of life, David wasn't just a performer. He was part of the language of their faith. And that's exactly why what happened next was so difficult for so many of them to sit with. A voice like David Phelps carries a weight that exists well below the surface of what an audience hears. Beneath the spiritual gift is a physiological reality, and that reality is not sympathetic to relentless touring schedules or to the specific physical demands of hitting notes that most tenors never attempt. Every night on the road, every recording session that pushed into that upper register, every performance that asked his voice to go where it had always gone before, was drawing on something that doesn't replenish indefinitely and doesn't warn you before it starts to give. People close to the touring life of the Gaither vocal band during the peak years of the late 1990s and early 2000s described the schedule as genuinely relentless. And that's not a complaint. That's just the reality of what Bill Gaither had built. The demand from audiences was constant, the dates accumulated, and the travel became a kind of permanent condition. David would come home to Shay and their children, and then the road would call again, and he would go, because that was the work, and the work felt like a calling, and you don't put a calling on hold because you're tired. What Shay has said publicly about those years is worth paying careful attention to. She described watching her husband give everything he had to an audience every single night, leaving it all on that stage without reservation, and then arriving home empty. And there's a particular loneliness in that, she said, watching someone you love pour themselves out completely for thousands of people and come through the door with nothing left to give the people who needed him most. Her words on this are quiet, but they carry more weight than most of what gets written about those years. But here's the thing that the people filling those seats couldn't see from where they were sitting. Underneath everything else, David was managing something that, for a man whose entire identity as a musician rested on what his voice could do, was about as frightening as anything in his professional life could get. His vocal cords were showing the kind of wear that specialists don't soften when they describe it. The notes that had made him famous, the ones that produced the end of the beginning moments and the Calvary moments, and above all the Jerusalem moments that fans still talk about decades later, were becoming harder to reach, harder to sustain, and the recovery time between performances was stretching in ways that couldn't be managed much longer without something giving way. And not just giving way temporarily, permanently. That matters in a very specific way when you understand how David Phelps thought about his voice. The people who knew him best during those years, Guy Penrod, Mark Lowry, Bill Gaither himself, will all tell you the same thing. David never treated a performance as a professional transaction. Every song was ministry, which meant that the possibility of his voice failing him wasn't a career problem. It landed somewhere much deeper and much harder to resolve than a career problem. But what David said during the period that followed that night, and what Shay confirmed separately in her own words, is the piece of this story that gospel media has moved past without slowing down. And that's exactly where we're headed. First, though, you need to understand what kind of night it was when David Phelps walked off that stage and didn't return. The Gaither vocal band had been on the road for weeks, the way they always were in those years, and the accumulation of nights and distances and performances had left almost no margin for anything to go wrong. David had been careful with his voice, the way any singer learns to be careful with an instrument that doesn't take days off even when the body needs them. But there are nights when careful management runs completely out of runway, when the account comes due all at once and there's nothing left to draw against. The people present at that performance have described a shift in the room partway through the evening. David was singing, giving the audience everything they had come to hear, and then something changed. A number ended, and instead of returning for the next one, he wasn't there. The other members of the Gaither vocal band covered as best they could, and the audience held its breath in the way that a room full of believers does when something has gone wrong and the right response isn't clear yet. They knew. None of them needed to be told. They just didn't know how serious it was, or how long it would be before they heard from him again. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in David's circle fully anticipated. What came out in the weeks following that night wasn't a quick explanation followed by a quicker recovery. What came out reframed, for a lot of people who had followed David's ministry for years, what they thought they understood about what that ministry had actually cost him. The vocal health situation had deteriorated to a point where continuing at the pace the Gaither vocal band demanded was no longer something the specialists would recommend. The performances that had built his reputation, the ones that filled auditoriums and left audiences talking for years afterward, were putting his voice at genuine risk of damage that wouldn't heal. And for a man who understood his voice as something given to him for a purpose larger than his own career, that wasn't a medical diagnosis he could simply accept and work around. That was a spiritual reckoning of a very specific and very personal kind. Around 2010, David stepped away from the Gaither vocal band. The reasons he gave publicly were genuine ones: more time with Shay and their children, more presence for the parts of family life that years on the road had quietly taken from him. Those things were true. But the whole truth included the voice and the fear of losing it for good, and the much harder question of what it would mean to be David Phelps without the instrument his entire ministry had been built around. What David has shared across interviews and conversations that have found their way back to fans over the years is that the period following that departure was among the hardest of his life. Not because he missed the applause. He has been consistent on that point, and the consistency tells you it's true. The hard part was the silence. The absence of that specific form of service, that specific channel through which he had expressed his faith since he was a young man, was something no amount of theological preparation had actually prepared him for. Guy Penrod, who shared the Gaither vocal band stage with David through so much of that history and has known him through all of it, has spoken about this period with a quietness that says more than any detailed account would. His description of David during that stretch was of someone who had to learn, in a very real and very difficult way, to actually trust what he had always sung about. The theology that holds when things are going well is easy. The theology that holds when the voice fails and the stage goes dark, that's the theology that gets tested, and tested hard. The response from fans when word traveled through the gospel community was not the grief of an audience afraid of losing their entertainment. The letters and prayers and messages that reached David and Shay were the response of people who recognized the territory from their own lives, who understood from personal experience what it means to face the loss of something you believed you were made to do. That kind of recognition travels differently than admiration. It carried actual weight. And then came what David eventually confirmed in his own words. The voice came back. Not identical to what it had been, changed in ways that a man of his honesty acknowledges plainly when the question gets asked directly. But back. And what he brought to his music after that period, the awareness of having nearly lost it, the specific gratitude of someone who has stood at that particular edge and returned, the theological depth of a man who actually walked through the valley instead of just singing about it, gave his performances something that raw technical brilliance alone never could have produced. When David returned to stages and to the Gaither world, the people who heard him noticed something they hadn't been able to name before. Wes Hampton, who had joined the Gaither vocal band during the years of David's absence, spoke about watching David perform after his return and hearing something in the voice that none of the earlier recordings contained. A tenderness, a weight that comes specifically from having needed the grace you're singing about rather than simply singing about it well. That's not a technique anyone teaches. That's something only a particular kind of journey produces. Shay, in the few moments she has chosen to speak publicly about this chapter, put it in words that stay with you after you've heard them. What she watched her husband go through was hard, in ways that were difficult to describe from the outside, she said. But what came out the other side was a man whose faith had been tested in the most personal way possible, and who had not let go of what he believed. And that, she said, turned out to be worth more than any note he ever reached. For those of us who have followed David's journey through the years, through the homecoming videos that have been playing in living rooms and on road trips and in hospital rooms across this country for 3 decades, this chapter of his story doesn't just hold interest. It's personal in a way that doesn't require explanation for this particular audience. The question David was sitting with during those hard months, the question of what remains when the thing you were given to do gets taken away, doesn't belong only to professional singers. That question arrives, in one form or another, for anyone who has built their sense of purpose around a specific capacity or a specific role or a specific way of serving. Faith communities understand this territory. The Gaither homecoming audience understands it perhaps better than most, because the songs they've been singing their whole lives were written for exactly this kind of moment. What kept fans returning to David's music through the complicated chapter, and what has sustained his place in the gospel world through everything, is the same thing the homecoming tradition has always understood better than the broader Christian music industry. An audience of genuine faith doesn't only want to hear people who sound beautiful. They want to hear people who have been somewhere real, who have stood in need of what they're singing about and found it sufficient. David's story, from the night he walked off that stage to the return that followed, gives him that in full measure. If you've been a fan of David Phelps since the early homecoming days, you know exactly what it means to watch someone stand at a microphone and mean every word he's singing. And what the story of that night ultimately tells us is that the meaning was never located in the performance itself. It lived in the man. That's worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet, and it changes the way the whole thing reads. David's experience, the vocal crisis, the departure from touring, the return with something changed and something deepened, follows a shape that has appeared in different forms and at different moments in the lives of several of the artists who have defined what the Gaither world is. And that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern worth looking at. Michael English, who sang with the Gaither vocal band during one of its most celebrated chapters, walked away from gospel music under circumstances that were far more public and far more painful than David's. The personal failures that ended his first chapter in the Gaither world are documented and were not hidden from anyone. But what Michael has spoken about in the years since, the long road back, the restoration he describes in specifically theological terms, the return to a stage he wasn't certain would receive him again, carries the same essential shape as what David went through. Loss, then silence, then something that looks, by any honest accounting, like grace doing what grace does. Russ Taff, whose voice has been among the most recognized in Christian music history for decades, has been similarly open about the years when addiction and personal struggle pulled him away from the ministry he had spent his life building. The honesty Russ brought to telling that story publicly, and the way the gospel community received his return, tells you something important about what this audience actually believes when it sings the songs it loves. Bill Gaither has been present for more of these difficult chapters than almost anyone else in gospel music, and what he has said, across many years and many conversations, is that the homecoming family was never assembled because everyone in it had things figured out. It was assembled because they all needed what they were singing about. David's chapter fits that tradition exactly, and that, in the end, is probably why it resonates as deeply as it does. The connection that most coverage of this story misses is straightforward. The Gaither homecoming tradition has not endured, despite the difficult chapters in the lives of its artists. In some real and important way, it has endured because of them. An audience of faith doesn't just want beautiful, they want true. And David Phelps, after everything that followed the night he walked off that stage, is both. What happens next for David Phelps and his family is something the gospel community will keep watching, and with genuine love rather than simple curiosity. Some questions still don't have full answers. How much of what that voice could do at its peak has been fully restored, and how much has been permanently changed by everything it's been through, is something only David knows with any real precision. What his ministry looks like in the seasons ahead, which songs he chooses, which stages he chooses, how he uses what he's been given after coming so close to losing it, remains a story that is still being written, one performance at a time. Whatever comes next, the fans who have followed this ministry for decades know something that doesn't require a full accounting to confirm. David Phelps's story isn't finished. The man who walked off that stage, who lived through the silence and the fear and the long road back, came out the other side still singing, still meaning it, still capable of making a room full of people feel something that moves past the music and settles somewhere deeper and more lasting. For those of us who have been with him from the beginning, that's reason enough to keep watching and to keep praying for whatever comes next. If this story moved you, the next video will as well. We've been covering the untold chapters behind some of the most beloved voices in the Gaither world, and what has come out of that reporting is just as unexpected and just as worth knowing.